Well, wonderful to see everybody here, and thank you, Hanny, for setting everything up. We're running one of our hybrid events, and so of course you're with us online as well. So don't forget what we do in these. We begin with the questions from the people here in person, then we go to questions online. But we've got lots of time to cover both, so that's absolutely fine. Now it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Veronica Strang here today. Veronica and I have known each other for very many years, so I'm probably pretty well qualified to give a brief introduction to her work. I remember from the very first time that we met that she has an extremely strong ability to convey anthropology through visual images. That's something that struck me always from the very outset, as I say, when I got to know her work, which was a very fine ethnography of the outback on Australia. And later on, she became a specialist, and a leading specialist in anthropological understandings of water. And she moved to take up the most distinguished position of the director of the Institute of, what exactly was it called? Higher Research at Durham?
The Institute of Advanced Studies.
Institute of Advanced Studies, indeed. Very distinguished, as you see, in Durham, from which she's recently retired. But one of the fruits, I imagine, from having a bit of leisure time, is this extraordinary, innovative new book, which certainly has traces of her earlier orientation in it, but of course in itself is entirely new and original. As you see, it's called Water Beings from Nature Worship to the Environmental Crisis. So I think we simply now turn to Veronica to give her a talk. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Dave. Now, what do I do here? Share screen, and then from beginning, I had idiot-proof instructions on the That's got it. We're there. Lovely. Well, afternoon, everybody. It's very lovely to be here. And of course, I want to start by thanking David Shanklin and the RAI very warmly for hosting this launch. I was very touched by David's enthusiastic suggestion to have this event, and the RAI team, of course, has been fabulously supportive. And I've had a lot of help over the last decade with this project. For example, from people like Jeremy Coote and Elizabeth Edwards, Sandy Toussaint, and the theologian John Day. And the book has also benefited enormously from the work of Alex Giovannou and the team at Reaction, who have been unfailingly supportive in getting 130 beautiful colour images and designing the book in the most wonderful way. So I'm most grateful for that help. There are an awful lot of old friends and colleagues who very patiently tolerated my long-standing obsession with water beings, and not just in anthropology. A number of specialists in other disciplines have also been very forgiving of me stumbling into their precious areas, and this has brought all kinds of other perspectives into the work. And most of all, of course, I want to thank you all for turning up or tuning in this afternoon to help christen water beings. It's very cheering in these rather parlous times to have something to celebrate. And although I've published a number of books at this latter stage in my career, you might think one becomes blasé about doing so. I'm particularly excited about this one because the project really has been the most wonderful intellectual adventure. And it began many years ago in the 1980s when I spent some time in the Australian outback with Aboriginal stock workers and learned about the Australian rainbow serpent. And when I returned to Cape York to do my doctoral research, I realised how central this being was to Indigenous beliefs. And when I was fortunate enough to be awarded an RAI Urgent Anthropology Fellowship in 1999, this led to a Goldsmiths anthropology research paper about life down under water and identity in a cultural landscape. But it was all about the rainbow serpent. So in fact, I've come full circle because the RAI has been foundational and primarily responsible for initiating an interest in this subject area. And by the time I crossed the Tasman Sea in 2000 and became acquainted with Maori tanifars, which is the name for water beings, I was completely hooked. And since then, alongside research on water rights and human environmental relationships in many parts of the world, my research has regularly focused on water beings, exploring their meanings with local communities and seeking them out in museums and archaeological sites. And this led to a realization that these beings are fantastically ubiquitous. They can be found anywhere, and I'm warning you now that you will now be doomed to spotting them wherever you go once you start, because they're always present, whether in contemporary cosmological schemes or in archaeological and historical records. So somehow, and I'm really not quite sure how, this project grew into this massive comparative study over several decades. And it drew on the work of a lot of other ethnographers, as well as archaeologists, historians, theologians, psychologists, classicists, as well as cognitive and neuroscientists. So in this sense, it is a very interdisciplinary project, although as you might expect from a Pitt Rivers Museum graduate, it is viewed through the lens of cultural anthropology. Surprisingly, although aquatic deities appear in many ethnographies and historical and theological material, and in any number of folkloric and popular stories, no one has ever done a systematic comparative study of them and the objects and images through which they're represented. And this is partly, I think, because in the last several decades, comparative methods have been rather discouraged in anthropology. And having worked for many years with Indigenous communities in Australia and New Zealand, I'm very familiar with the critical reflections on anthropological methods and on our discipline. But I would suggest that in providing a meta-discourse that is collectively composed by multiple knowledges, anthropology is fundamentally and necessarily comparative, and it places human behaviour within a larger analytic frame, while simultaneously valorizing the uniqueness of specific cultural and historical contexts. But we can discuss that if you like. But from my point of view, it has always been more important to follow the evidence than to follow fashion. And working on water issues in many different places has brought home to me how persistently meanings and ideas about water flow across cultural and historical boundaries. And this cross-cultural persistence I've suggested comes from several key factors. First, of course, it reflects the centrality of water in all human lives and its essential role in the generation and reproduction on life at all scales, from the tiniest microbial levels to whole ecosystems. And second, of course, water has consistent material properties, even in diverse environments. It retains its elemental fluidity, its transformational capacities to solidify and evaporate, to carry and sometimes bond with other materials, and to shape the landscapes through which it flows. So despite cultural differences in priority for sensory experience, there's basic commonality in human phenomenological experiences with water. We share a physical need for its constant supply. We taste, smell, feel, and hear it through the same sensory avenues, and we can't help but recognize its vital role in our lives. And clearly relevant as well are the common cognitive processes which, as Levi-Strauss observed, people think with the material world. And in these terms, of course, water is very good to think, as he put it. Its fluid form and animated movements readily enable concepts of flow, time, movement, and change, which are, of course, indispensable in envisioning any and all social and material processes. So it's really not that surprising that water beings appear ubiquitously in human history. And as we know, early societies worshipped the non-human domain, or what we now call nature and its elements. And so, of course, they valorized important water deities who personified or manifested the creative and potentially destructive powers of water. And these deities remain important in many cultural contexts. So though they also reflect cultural and historical diversity, water beings share some very important commonalities. Literally, in essence, they embody the material properties and behaviors of water, its serpentine form, its fluid movements, its glittering surfaces, its colors, its capacities to enable orderly production and reproduction, or to sometimes to bring disorder and chaos. So in effect, these beings are imaginatively composed of water, and you can see from this very beautiful 12th century Japanese cloud dragon who's arched back, who is in the process of materializing out of the clouds. It's in a process of sort of Deleuzian becoming, emerging, materializing. And that gives us a very clear sense that it's composed of water, as does the little Chinese dragon on the right there, which has an arched back, which means bow. In fact, its name, Lung or Long, actually means bow, coming from rainbow. So what we have here, in fact, is this massive extended family of objects and images and stories whose shared formal characteristics and cosmological roles express universal human processes of engagement with water, cognitive process of thinking with the material world, and the materialities of water itself, as well as reflecting particular cultural and historical relationships with water and the non-human domain. So comparing these relationships systematically has turned up some very intriguing findings about what water beings do in diverse contexts, what happened to them over time, and how they reveal religious, political, and technological changes. Crucially, they provide important insights into how and why so many societies have moved away from venerating nature, treating it respectfully, to the exploitative practices that have led to the current environmental crisis. And this also tells us why traditional water beings are now resurfacing in contemporary debates about indigenous rights and the rights of non-human species. So what do water beings do? Being composed of water and its physical properties, water beings provide ways to formulate concepts of cyclical movement and flow and the passage of time. And this capacity to provide an infinite vision of temporal cycles is exemplified in images of the Ouroboros with a world encircling serpent, which appears in early Egyptian iconography and recycles on through multiple other traditions, for example, in the Greek Okeanos, the Norse Jormungandr. And as water beings manifest the creative, life-giving powers of water, it's no surprise to find they have a central role in many stories of cosmic origin, which describe how the world was formed out of material chaos, fluid chaos, and how it came to be inhabited by human and other living kinds. So for the most part, these stories are about how social and material order are established. But it's worth noting the obverse side to this creativity, in which there's always a dark side, a potential return to chaos, represented by the dual capacities of water to generate life, but also to consume and destroy it. So in this sense, water beings all have a dark side, reflecting their potential to be monstrous and punitive. And in this sense, the research resonates very nicely with some of the emerging work on monsters and why societies need them. But in the early origin stories, their major role is the creation of material and social order rather than disorder. And this is illustrated in ancient Egyptian texts, describing how a great serpent rose out of primal seas to create and name all parts of the world. So for the ancient Babylonians too, the world begins, this is Tiamat here, representing salt and fresh water, Tiamat and Apsu. And here, as in many instances, the world is created from the body of the serpent. And this kind of parthenogenesis also appears in Norse, Chinese, Aztec, and other origin stories, establishing the creative serpent as the primal ancestor of all living kinds. So in Mayan beliefs, for example, a world-creating serpent being rises from primal chaos to carry the world on its back and to generate, as we see here, creative deities. In Orphic theology, the earth, Gaia, is drawn from the waters of Okeanos and the matter that it contains via a winged dragon called Kronos, meaning undecaying time, who generates all things. In Aboriginal Australia, in the dreaming, the rainbow serpent spits or spews or sometimes defecates living kinds out of a pool of ancestral water held in the land to form the landscape. And in doing so, it provides all of the totemic, usually non-human ancestors for the human clans that follow. It also reflects the co-creativity of water in forming a particular land and cultural waterscape. And I thought you might enjoy a short animation that I've been working on collaboratively. And this is part of a proposal I'm putting together for a documentary series about the film of the book, if you like. So we need to go to our serpent animation. Helen, I'm going to let you do the techie bit, if that's all right.
Yeah. Sorry, I wanted to. Yeah, we did this.
No, doesn't matter. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's the folder with this bit here. Okay. That's it. At the bottom, sadly. Okay.
The rainbow serpent has appeared in ancient Australian rock art for millennia. Stories about its creative powers have been passed down through generations in songs, dances, art and ritual. A story from Cape York tells how in the early days, in the creative era of the dream time when the world was formed, a rainbow serpent emerged to make a vast river. Roaring through the land, the rainbow serpent is followed by another ancestral being, in the form of the night pigeon, in Elar. Though the rainbow serpent is travelling underground, the night pigeon can hear the tree roots breaking and see water bubbling up in its wake. In Elar flies ahead to a waterhole and waits. There, he spears the serpent through the chest. The confrontation causes the rainbow serpent to let go of the string bag full of flying foxes that it is carrying, releasing them into the world. Enraged by the attack, the rainbow serpent wraps its coils around Inilar, trapping him. Engulfed, Inilar escapes by diving through the hole made by his spear. In literally passing through the rainbow, the night pigeon acquires secret and sacred knowledge, which gives him special powers. So, in this Dreamtime story, the rainbow serpent forms the landscape, brings water, knowledge and life into the world, and, according to Aboriginal beliefs, continues to do so today, generating human beings and other living kinds, and providing the flows of water that sustain them.
Okay. Stop share? No, I won't.
In India, for example, a powerful naga or water
See, you should never let me touch it.
No. Are we going to this one or are we going back to the slides?
We go back to the slides.
Okay.
Okay.
So,
That's fine.
okay. Hopefully, this will block.
Okay, so that was just a little tiny animation of the rainbow. So it was very experimental and quite an adventure, I have to say, working with animators. Utility role in continuing to bring the rain and to generate life cycles on a more everyday basis. So as sources of fertility, rainbow serpents and other water beings represent duality in gender and in character, or sometimes they simply contain both genders, or we might say today a whole spectrum of genders, and they often appear with two heads. Is that not moving forward?
Use the arrow on
We're not happening here.
Yeah, just have a look.
There we go.
yeah, no,
Oh,
that
that's
works.
good. Okay, so they often appear with two heads, or as twins, or as creative couples. For example, in the dual nagas who guard so many temples across Asia, in the intertwined anacondas of Amazonian cosmologies, and in the twin Aztec beings, Checaltitlicoca and Quetzalcoatl, who form the world out of a third sea serpent. And this notion of gender complementarity has persisted in the Caduceus, which you see here, depicted originally by the Sumerian goddess Inanna, worshipped from about 4000 BCE, which is still used to represent healing today. And because of the material likenesses between snakes and water, they're often snake-like in form and colour. And this relationship between serpents and water beings is another nice example of how cognitive processes rely on thinking with particular things. So snakes conveniently reflect the serpentine movement of rivers and streams. They slither away underground, they hatch their eggs in wet seasons, and new snakes appear with the rains. So there's a material logic in the snake-like features of water beings, but they're also hybrid figures. They materially incorporate the local life forms that they generate. And this lends them not just cultural, but also geographical particularity. So in Australian rainbow serpents, you can see, for example, not just snake-like features, but kangaroo heads, yam leaves, crocodile scales, and the cross-hatching that signifies different types of savanna grasses. In Central American water beings such as Quetzalcoatl, they feature the green features, they're feathered serpents, and they feature the green feathers of the sacred Quetzal bird. And then you get the water lily serpents and the tendrils whose roots reach down into the underworld of Xibalba. In Africa, you find them carrying the colourful patterns of local pythons and the horns of gazelles and so forth, or other ungulates. And on the west coast of the Americas, they beings such as Sisyutl are often shown with the heads of wolves and bears. And as the deities responsible for bringing the rain, water beings also have a key role in manifesting hydrological cycles. They demonstrate early societies' very sophisticated understandings of the movements of water and how it moves between earth and sky. So in the Far East, dragons like this are very explicitly described as ascending and descending dragons, and they're commonly depicting connecting clouds and waves. And as this implies, they represent water in all its forms, not only water bodies at an earthly level, but also water that is airborne and which composes the celestial half of the hydrological cycle. And this is why in many parts of the world, such as the American pueblos, water beings are represented with feathers or wings, and they're shown spitting fire and lightning, the necessary precursors to rain. And this, of course, includes the fire-spitting dragons, as we call them here, described in our part of the world. And many of the water beings around the world are actually explicitly described as lightning serpents. And it's perhaps worth noting that early societies didn't divide the categories of fire and water in the way that we do today. There was quite a lot of debate amongst the Greek philosophers, for example, about the extent to which these were interchangeable sorts of ideas. And it's also worth bearing in mind, of course, that in the dark skies that prevailed prior to artificial lighting, these celestial bodies were much more visible, so that in multiple cultural and historical contexts, you get water beings arranged as cosmologically central beings, such as Draco in Greco-Roman terms. There's a great boa amongst the Arawak-speaking tribes in Amazonia. In some cosmologies, we go back to Australia, the Milky Way features as a sky river, so it's inhabited here by major totemic beings. In China, it's described as Tianhe, the silvery way. And in some cosmologies, they provide, of course, in most cosmologies really, a metaphor of flows of water and time. They communicate ideas about life-bringing hydrological cycle. So it's not difficult to understand why they also have a complementary role in articulating ideas about life and death and hydrotheological cycles. So for those of you who haven't run into this term, a hydrotheological cycle describes how spirit and matter flow through the world. And following the movements of water, the spirit is carried through non-material dimensions of being, is incarnated in material form on an earthly visible plane, and then at the end of life returns to an invisible non-material domain, sometimes in a celestial realm, sometimes in a watery underworld, and sometimes a bit of both. So in Australia, for example, the rainbow serpent is believed to generate each person's spirit from a pool of ancestral force in the clan's estate. And the term for this movement actually translates as becoming visible or becoming material. They live their lives, they draw closer to the ancestral beings as they age, and when they die, their spirit has to be ritually sung back to this home to be reunited with the ancestors, while part of it flies out west towards the sun. So in this sense, the hydrotheological cycle provided by traditional water beings, reflecting ideas of the flow of spirit and matter through time and space, provide a vital social function in answering a perennial question: where do we come from, where do we go when we die? And because they represent an ongoing recycling of flows, they also offer a little bit of optimism about the potential of a return. And this passage in and out of material being is also a question of acquiring and losing consciousness, the consciousness that defines a person. So a related task of water beings is therefore to bring consciousness and wisdom to humans, both on a cosmic and an individual scale. So according to the pyramid texts here, the great serpent of ancient Egypt, in creating the world out of the primal seas, also brings light and consciousness by speaking the word and naming everything, as does Sesha, the multi-headed serpent king of the Indian Nagas, who in speaking the Bhagavata actually brings the world and consciousness into being. In Haitian traditions, carried from Africa, the great serpent Damballa and Aida Weda, the rainbow, bring spiritual life and wisdom to humankind. In Central America, Quetzalcoatl brings knowledge about all things, and on a more individual level, the Mayan vision serpent, accessed through a very painful bloodletting ritual, is a source of enlightenment. And the rainbow serpent in Australia is a source of what Indigenous communities call the law, which is their whole body of traditional knowledge. And as our Cape York story illustrated, it's an important water ritual. Passing through the rainbow provides secret and sacred knowledge. And as all of this implies, water serpent beings illuminate the kinds of relationships with the material world and other species that are promoted by nature religions and their veneration of non-human deities. So in Australia, as in many long-standing place-based cultures, they're major authority figures in what is fundamentally an indivisible shared world in which human and non-human beings coexist on more equal and reciprocal terms. And inalienable relationships with place are geared towards long-term sustainability. So this brings us to some of the key theoretical contributions of this research. Emil Durkheim famously provided anthropology with a tenet that religious arrangements reflect political organization. So societies with flat political structures, such as those led gerontocratically by all of their elders, tend to have multiple ancestral deities with a similar lack of hierarchy. And he observed that as societies became more stratified, they also acquired more hierarchical religious forms. What this research highlights is a similarly systematic relationship between changing religious and political forms and society's material engagements with the non-human domain. And I would make a methodological point here, that this and related findings demonstrate how a cross-cultural and historically comparative study, drawing on multiple ethnographies and other disciplines, can illuminate patterns that can't be seen through a single ethnographic focus. In effect, water beings provide a very useful indicator of how societies develop different developmental trajectories that in many cases have taken them away from these respectful, sustainable relationships with their environments to the kinds of exploitative and unsustainable practices that pertain today. So what actually happens to these aquatic deities over time in different contexts elucidates the factors that cause very critical changes in human, non-human relations. So if we follow their fortunes, we can see in hunter-gatherer societies focused on nature worship, totemic ancestral deities are typically multiple and non-human in form, and they tend to express equitable relationships between humankind and other species, and with key material elements such as water. In such relationships, the non-human domain is an active, relatively equal partner in co-creating shared human and non-human lives. And in such contexts, they have a great deal of authority. They're generally beneficent and life-creating, but as I said previously, they're also powerful and dangerous and willing to punish transgressions of the law. So, for example, there are lots of stories in Australia where rainbow serpents swallow trespassers at sacred sites or seek vengeance against people who fail to respect the law. And this underlines their dual capacities to create an orderly, productive world, or to be monstrous and embody perennial human fears of being overwhelmed by chaos and disaster. But what happens to water beings over time demonstrates a critical shift in this relatively equal balance of power. And this began, of course, with the emergence of agriculture and the domestication of plants and animals, which, as well as imposing human control over other species, initiated a spiral of human population growth. And at first, small-scale farming and rice growing, using low bunds to capture annual floods, didn't have a major impact on religious and political organization. Nature worship remained in place. There was a stronger emphasis on water beings' capacity to bring annual rains for crops, and the celestial beings signaling the shift from one planting season to another. So, for example, here, the horned pueblos, lightning-spitting serpents, acquired maize collars, or sometimes they sprouted corn from their mouths, and their veneration shifted towards very important rain-making rituals at specific times of the year. But this began to change when the emergence of major irrigation societies, for example, in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley, and in Imperial China. And these are societies that sought to exert more instrumental control over water, using dams and channels to direct its flows into human activities. And constructing and maintaining major infrastructures requires considerable labour and social and political coordination. So, as Hocart observed, this encouraged more hierarchical, more centralised forms of government, and they were led by religious elites and supreme leaders, pharaohs, kings, emperors, who gained divine powers, and they started to take over the sacred responsibility of providing water to their populations. So the role of water beings was reduced to providing support to deified human rulers. And this can be seen, for example, in this little shot of Tutankhamun's headdress by the use of the uraeus more as an accessory to the human figure. And it can also be seen very readily in the emergence of a Chinese imperial dragon, which expressed the power of the emperor over the state and the non-human domain, rather than simply venerating the powers of nature. And here's an interesting thing that starts to happen. As divine rulers take over the powers of water deities, one of the more intriguing patterns of change that comes from this kind of comparison is a process by which nature deities are systematically humanized as societies gain more and more material control over the world. And in many cases, previously non-human serpentine water beings acquire human heads and torsos, suggesting an important shift in the locus of supernatural powers. And continuing this pattern, some beings previously depicted in serpent form are entirely humanized. So, for example, with Isis and Osiris, there we are, in serpentine form, give way to their depiction as human figures. Zeus also provides us with a very nice example. He first appears as what was called the kindly serpent, Zeus Malikios, and then transitions into being a bearded male human who nevertheless still generates other beings from his head, apparently, and brings humankind consciousness and wisdom. So my point is that as human societies develop technologies enabling them to direct water flows and reshape the material environment to serve their own interests, religious and political hierarchies emerge in which human, or at least semi-human, deities hold the balance of power. And in theoretical terms, what this suggests to me is that Durkheim's tenet that religious beliefs mirror political changes actually needs a third pillar, acknowledging the importance of human instrumentality in defining society's relationships with the non-human domain. So in some contexts, previously all-powerful serpent beings become subservient to entirely humanized deities. For example, in Hindu stories, Vishnu, or his avatar Krishna's first incarnation, is as the great serpent Ananta, while Kali is described as the deep blue one. This dark fluidity is the source of life. But over time, new imagery comes to the fore in which a humanized Krishna and his consort are shown reclining on the great serpent Sesha, and a similarly humanized Mother Ganges is carried by a water being. So as societies become more hierarchical and patriarchal, with widening inequalities, greater inequality also appears with the non-human domain. And this is expressed in stories in which human deities exert punitive control over water beings who fail to be compliant to their will. And such demonstrations of human power are usually performed by male deities or culture heroes. And this is where we need our next animation, because there's a very well-known Indian legend. Krishna subdues the poisonous serpent Kalia by making himself vast and dancing on the serpent's multiple heads until Kalia's serpent wives beg him to show mercy. So there's a little tiny animation, if we can do this, honey, showing part of the collaborative work that I've been doing.
And let's quickly move to the beginning.
Okay.
In India, for example, a powerful Naga or water being, Kalia, inhabited the Yamuna River. The water in the pool where he lived was said to boil with the fire of his poison, and birds flying over it would fall into the water, killed by the rising vapour. The god Krishna leapt from a tree into the poisonous water, and making himself vast, danced on Kalia's multiple heads, causing him great anguish. The serpent's wives begged Krishna to show mercy and forgive their sinful husband. For most of human history, societies around the world worship nature and nature deities.
Sorry about that.
That's fine. That's fine. Thank you. That's good. So we have these culture heroes that come along, start to repress water and demonstrate human control over it. And increasingly, as instrumentality increases, these interactions between culture heroes and water beings involve greater violence. And this is partly reflective of that universal psychological need to exert control over chaos. There's always been male culture heroes slays monstrous serpent stories. For example, the Mesopotamian tale of Marduk slaying Tiamat, or the Egyptian sun god outwitting Apophis the destroyer. But it seems that it seems that we've got stuck.
It's doing it again. What is it?
What do we do? What did you do last time?
Sure, I can't.
Okay, we'll skip that one. Okay. So, it seems that as societies gained this instrumental control over the environment and sought to have more of it, this encouraged more adversarial and more kind of coercive relationships with the water beings that represent the untamed powers of the non-human domain. So you get this huge emergence of multiple heroes coming out to assert human dominion over nature in different times and places. So we have Greco-Roman stories of Heracles hacking away at the Hydra, Scandinavian sagas of Sigurd saying Fafnir and Beowulf defeating Grendel. In Mari tales, Tamaray slaughters a dangerous Tanifar. In the Rig Veda, the god Indra defeats the serpent Vritra and notably wrestles the control of water away from him. And this is something that becomes a very large central kind of theme, if you like. And another thing that comes with this, which I found absolutely fascinating, is how these humanized deities, having taken over the power and the role and responsibilities of water beings, still had to meet their cosmological responsibilities, both to control the flows of water through the world and to ensure those orderly cycles of life and death. So some of these culture heroes actually replicate the role of serpent beings in performing cycles of movement between visible and invisible, sometimes underworld domains. So this fertility deity, Dionysus, is described as a typical dying and rising god. He carries souls between the world of the living and the dead via a lake, which is no coincidence here, the home of the Liaonian Hydra, slain by Heracles, and therefore performs a hydrotheological cycle of death and renewal. Orpheus similarly echoes the cyclical movements between worlds, and the story of Demeter and Persephone is of course wholly focused on this creation of annual cycles of life and death. And this pattern of deity humanization and the alienation between human and other living kinds reaches an apogee with the emergence of the major patriarchal religions, in which rather than having pantheons of gods and goddesses associated with aspects of the non-human domain, you get supreme power invested in a single male deity conceptually located in a far-off heaven. But even these lofty supreme beings have to answer those perennial existential questions about how the world comes into being, how life is generated, how persons arrive and depart, and whether they're reincarnated or moved on to other worlds. So they make what is in effect a complete takeover of the hydrotheological role previously held by powerful water deities. So like the great serpent described in the pyramid texts, they perform acts of cosmogenesis. They separate those primal waters to make light, to make order out of chaos, name everything with the world. They bring consciousness and wisdom. And then replicating the hydrotheological cycle, they descend and ascend between earthly and celestial domains. They become responsible for the cyclical movement of the human spirit between material and non-material forms. And like the earlier nature beings, they're omnipresent, sentient, watchful, and sometimes punitive, demanding obedience to the law. And to achieve this authority, the supreme father gods control the flow of water. They bring the rain at the right time and in the right quantities, or they withhold it or send overwhelming floods. But there's an important difference in this takeover. Embodying human power rather than manifesting the powers of water itself, they preach dominion over the material world and the beasts of the field. They establish human exceptionalism and create a deepening divide between human male culture and an increasingly feminized nature. So in this logical extension of human instrumentalism, the non-human domain gets recast as a compliant and virtuous mother providing sustenance to human needs, or as a recalcitrant and unruly female over which patriarchal control has to be exerted. And such alienation from the non-human domain opens the door to a spiral of infrastructural development in which the imposition of control over water and land encourages further population growth, urbanization, and more exploitative and, as we now know, completely unsustainable practices. And of course, this is very bad news for our long valorized water beings. militant monotheisms compete not only with each other, but with the earlier nature religions, which they describe as idolatry, paganism, and heresy. And in Europe, as early missionaries spread the word, Christian saints take over the holy wells and the water made holy by God's blessing now, providing this healing and spiritual well-being that was previously offered by local nature deities. And in the process, the nature beings, and particularly those representing the chaotic powers of water, are demonized. So you get what is basically a reversal of earlier historical narratives. The so-called dragon becomes the embodiment of evil, the gaping maw at the mouth of hell, from which only believers and repentant sinners can be rescued. And this fiery hell is, of course, an antithesis of the creative underworlds of earlier religions, from which water beings held in the land generate springs and life. So by the early medieval period, rather than bringing lightning and rain, celestial serpents bring fire and pestilence, and the skies and swamps are full of them, requiring crusader knights to gallop into battle, not just to slaughter the infidels who worship false idols, but to gain supremacy over the beings representing the powers of nature. So you get, in the medieval period, a veritable orgy of dragon slaying by knights and saints, with considerable penetrative stabbing that, as Samantha Jones observes, is not subtle in its depiction of male power over female nature. And this extreme violence against serpent beings only subsides once the major monotheisms have asserted their control. And aggression against unbelievers and nature religions is carried further afield as militant evangelism and colonial hegemony carry competing monotheisms into every corner of the world. So local communities are forced to adopt their colonizers' beliefs and practices, although they often added these as a kind of extra layer whilst covertly continuing with their own kind of belief systems. And then this globalization of ideas about religious and political dominion over nature puts a lot of societies onto this trajectory of development in which they seek coercive control. And this entails what Dennis Rogers and Bruce O'Neill describe as infrastructural violence, which I would suggest resonates directly with the symbolic violence directed at the beings representing the powers of nature. And this supremacy of human power over the non-human domain is further encouraged by the disenchanting effects of deconstructive scientific knowledges, which replace visions of sentient, conscious land and waterscapes with a more Cartesian view of the material world, and water gets reduced to the physics of H2O. So these support the emergence of capitalist growth-based economies that reframe the living environment as material resources whose primary purpose is to serve human needs and interests and to bear the costs of human activities. Which gets us to where we are now, not just widening human inequalities, but the mass extinction of species, the degradation of water and land, and calamitous climate change. So there's actually a bitter irony here that all of these coercive efforts to control the material world and achieve the stability that this is meant to provide now seem likely to bring precisely the chaos that they were intended to prevent. And meanwhile, what has happened to our water beings? Well, they've proved remarkably resilient. As I implied, in many societies, people continued, sometimes covertly, to valorize their non-human deities. And these multiple quiet subversions were not confined to just colonized indigenous people like in Australia and Africa, but can be seen also in rural communities in China, where people conducted secret rituals despite Maoist prohibitions of religious practices. And in many societies, water beings were subsumed, but they were never exterminated. They kind of slipped sideways into folklore, harmless myriad stories about dragons and serpents. So the lantern worm being the Norse term for dragon, orm, is the subject of a popular song in my birthplace in Durham. And in northern Spain, we have Il Culebre lurking in the gorges of Los Picos Mountains. And just recently, I think there have been some sightings of the Loch Ness Monster, a serpent first reported in the River Ness by the abbot of Iona in the 6th century, where reportedly it was repulsed by the sign of the cross. And as this implies, having been demonized in the reverse narratives of the major religions, water beings have sort of continued to represent out of control and therefore sinful nature. So even today, in Durham, one of the most powerful bishop positions in the country, a new bishop still participates in a ritual conducted on a bridge over the river in Croft-on-Tees, where he's handed a medieval sword and is required to swear to slay the dragon. I know, this is lovely, isn't it? And so when I interviewed the recent incumbent, Paul Butler, who you may have all seen recently if you sat through the coronation, I asked him what the dragon meant to him, and he said rather dramatically, I thought, "It's all the evil in the world." But this is not how such beings are portrayed in contemporary art and literature. And what has happened comparatively to our water beings over time is very revealing of changing ideas, because in the arts and literature, their role has gone through some very interesting transitions. In fact, I could have written a whole book just about their role in the media. So as you might expect, in an earlier, more religiously influenced literature, they appear as chaos monsters, the embodiments of evil. But with growing concerns about social and environmental injustice, there's been quite a discernible shift towards more sympathetic portrayals of dragons and serpent beings, expressing a desire for reconciliation and a return to more convivial human-non-human relations. So while there are some fairly ghastly films, such as Avatar, in which male human heroes subdue serpents into serving them, there are also books and films in which children befriend dragons. There's an emergent fantasy literature, often written by women, in which dragons regain their position as beneficent holders of wisdom and power and have telepathic connections with humans. And in this sense, recent art and literature express increasing anxieties about capitalism and its destruction, and reflects a deep longing for reconciliation with non-human beings and their creative powers. So in these depictions, rather than being evil adversaries, our nature beings are increasingly depicted as empathetic, wise, and mutually supportive of humankind. And this goes hand in hand with the rise of neo-paganism and the reinvention of rituals venerating water beings. So just a few weeks ago, on May Day, I recorded an event in Cerne Abbas, which is the site of the great giant, and where water and its local generative powers were valorized by the creation of an otter dragon, which, as you can see, is on a bridge there. And this is actually Kate Adie's garden in Cerne. And there are obvious links also with activism, nature worship, and social and environmental counter movements generally. So since the 60s, we've had environmental and feminist activists fighting for social and ecological justice and greater equality. And this has led, of course, to alliances with indigenous communities around the world, aiming to reclaim or at least protect their homelands. They're participating actively in international conversations and seeking to promote alternate beliefs and values. And in doing so, they're providing a very strong critique of dominant neoliberal ideologies and unsustainable practices. And of course, what better way to articulate this critique? What better way to express a cri de coeur about beloved homelands than to bring back to the surface powerful nature beings that manifest the creative powers of water and the non-human domain? So, for example, in North America, First Nations communities use their traditional imagery to express concerns about oil pipelines and the pollution of lakes and rivers. In Africa, Mani Water is called upon to demonstrate Ogoni opposition to the devastation of the Niger Delta. If we go back to New Zealand, we find Maori communities bringing their taniwha to the table in political battles to protect waterways. And then across the Tasman, the Australian rainbow serpent is absolutely central to debates about water and rights. And in fact, just last summer, I was involved in a major legal case in which marine rainbow serpents played a vital role in enabling Tiwi Islanders in Northern Australia to prevent a major multinational from drilling for hydrocarbons in their sea country. So in political debates around the world, water serpent beings are resurfacing to articulate beliefs and values in human, non-human relations characterized not by exploitative inequalities in power, but by veneration and respect for other living kinds and ecosystems. So to conclude, while a study of water beings around the world may seem a little esoteric, they have a lot to tell us. Their ubiquity and their shared characteristics provide us with very important insights into the universal sensory engagements and processes of cognition through which humans think with material elements and their properties and imagine hydrological and spiritual movements through time and space. Their central role in multiple cosmologies tell us how early societies made sense of the world and created those first foundational layers of what is clearly a palimpsest of religions that followed, in which in different times and places deities changed form to reflect new ideas and practices. They reveal a fascinating pattern of change in which, as human instrumentality exerts increasing control over the material world, religious divinities are humanized to reflect this dominion. And yet they still have to perform the same roles in bringing life, generating water, and in carrying spirit and matter through time and space. So it turns out that these wonderful imaginative water beings provide an ideal narrative device for understanding the shifting complexities of how societies distribute power and well-being between humans and between human and non-human beings and the material world. Personifying those co-creative, potentially destructive non-human powers, they tell us how societies have travelled from respectful collaborative nature worship to the abuses of power leading to the current environmental crisis. And in their resurfacing in lively international and intercultural political debates, they provide alternate ways for us to think about how we might engage with water and the non-human domain, and how we might do so more sustainably. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. As beautifully illustrated as always. So I really did enjoy that. Well, my eyes enjoyed it enormously. Now, would anybody like a drink or anything? Isaac, you don't have a drink. Would you like a glass of wine?
Water.
Water? Oh dear, everybody's getting so abstinence these days, aren't they? I don't know why, but here we are. Let me give you a glass of water.
I'll fall asleep lovely.
Would you like any?
No, I've got some.
No, that's from me.
Okay.
Well, I thought that was absolutely marvellous. Of course, there are sort of smaller questions and larger questions. I mean, one of the smaller questions is how did your inner dialogue with Levi Strauss go? I mean, you must have had one.
Yes, we had a lovely chat.
But I mean, could you tell us a little bit of how you articulated your work in contrast with his?
Well, obviously his work on totemism is central because it really does establish in anthropology, if you like, the notion of non-human ancestral being, which is so central to this work. So it's in that sense, but and also the sort of notion of how we think with those beings and other materials. I mean, I think that this research is really founded on the idea that we think with the material world, or as he put it, the world is inside our heads, in a sense, the material world. And in fact, this has always interested me, that you can't really think without making use of the material world in which we live to think with. So we wouldn't have a concept of stability if we didn't understand the properties of stone. We wouldn't have a concept of growth without plants, and we can't have a concept of flow and time without water. So these things are really very foundational to how humans make sense of the world. And that is why I think, you get these wonderful sort of cross-cutting ideas about hydrotheological cycles that benefit from the fact that particularly early societies spend most of their time observing the environment very closely and how it happens. So they have a wonderful understanding of how that happens. But there's also the issue of equality. When you work with indigenous societies who have non-human clan ancestors, there isn't that sense of human exceptionalism that prevails in our everyday life here. It's simply taken for granted. And then there are, of course, so many societies in which people shift between human and non-human boundaries. You go, the Inuit, you find, they say the world has no others, only persons. And of course, that brings us into the notion of personhood for non-human beings and rivers, which is such a current topic of debate in talking about non-human rights. So I think I think in that sense, the early work on totemism is a great foundation for thinking about current debates as to whether non-human beings should have legal personhood and or rights of various kinds. So I think it puts us on a really important path.
Very good, very good, very good. I'm going to ask another one whilst people are thinking, because where does matriarchy fit into all this? Because in general terms, moving on to your broad conceptions of history, I mean, you'll remember that there was a time when the feminist movement to which you alluded tried to resurrect the idea that there was a matriarchy before patriarchy, and you could see that in the symbolic objects of the Neolithic, particularly thinking about women goddesses and so on. But you rather assumed that we went from paganism to patriarchy.
You're right. I could have said a lot more about gender, and there is a sort of look at this in the book. I mean, obviously, as a committed feminist, I'm very keen to read the feminist theologians and anthropologists and their analyses of these things. And it is contentious, and it's contentious partly because it challenges patriarchal assumptions. But there are some wonderful writers like Christine Spretnak and other theologians that kind who really have looked at this stuff. And I wouldn't be inclined to make any kind of generalizing statement about movements from matriarchy to patriarchy. What I would say is, if we go back to Durkheim and assume that political life and religious life are reflective of each other, when you have societies such as Aboriginal Australians, who I've worked with, who are led by gerontocratic rule, everybody gets to be an elder, men and women, everybody gets to own property jointly, everybody gets to be part of decisions making. So if you ask what are the indicators of equality in society, property ownership, participation in political decision making sounds pretty good to me. So you've got a flat political structure which is relatively gender equal. If you look at some of the work by classicists in Europe, for example, there's a very strong case to be made that there were a number of very strongly matriarchal religious movements. There's certainly a lot of powerful goddesses. If you go back, and I suppose this is going back to what I did talk about, which is the gender complementarity of water beings, in which they either contain both genders or have complementary gender relationships, then that also speaks to political equality of various kinds. So I don't think it's so much as a question of sort of boxing it as a matriarchal thing as recognizing that equality between genders is part of what has been lost in that developmental process. What you can see is not only a sharpening divide between human and non-human beings, but a sharpening gender inequality that goes with that, and that's expressed by the feminization of nature as opposed to the supposedly rational male culture. So I think those things kind of fit together in a kind of logical way, to the extent that we can say that where we have lost equality, we've lost it between humans and others, and gender is clearly part of that package. And you can, if you start reading the classicists about changes in Greek society, you get this kind of pre-Hellenistic society where there are clearly very important goddesses. And then with sort of later Greek classicism, you get the incoming Dacians and more patriarchal kinds of ways of thinking. And you can actually see the transition in the pantheons of Greek gods, because they start off representing each part of nature. There's male and female gods, and then you get a sort of something that sounds a little bit like the reverse narrative that comes with the monotheisms. The female gods get weakened, they become regarded in more hostile terms, they become less, Medusa, Medea. You find that they become evil women when they're not being compliant. So you can actually, it's the same old story. So in effect, what you can see is a transition of increasing inequality in gender along the way. And you end up with these more powerful male gods that have also transitioned away from being non-human. And then you get, of course, the ultimate patriarchy of monotheistic beliefs. So you can actually see a really interesting pattern of inequality accompanied by religious changes in how people represent their deities, and how that ties in with the technical instrumentality that gives humans coercive control over the material world. And I think that's the most exciting stuff to come out of this research, is being able to see how those patterns kind of work together. Does that answer your question?
Why? I'm sure it will lead to many other questions. Please, who would like to ask a question? Go ahead, please.
Yes, so my name is
Can you
Sayana.
shout at me?
Yes, so my name is Sayana. I'm research fellow at the Mongolia in Asia Studies Unit at the Department of Social Anthropology in Cambridge. So I do research on the transborder water river, on transborder river Selenga, which runs from Mongolia to Lake Baikal. And it brings 80% of kind of fresh water to Lake Baikal, which contains 40% of the fresh world water. Yes, it's kind of enormously important. But we kind of also have labor division within the project, because my colleague, he mostly deals with these anthropocentric models of the managing this water, and I'll deal with the kind of water beings and Losat, like water deities, mostly kind of that were refrained by Buddhism, and we kind of try to explore how these traveling gods from Nagas, from Hinduism, travel to Himalaya, and then travel further to Mongolia and in Asia and become things, creatures, which I'm studying now. And I'm particularly interested in the kind of a kinship in the local communities, how they trace not only their kind of a very remote ancestors, but kind of very direct, like my grandfather was born as a lost, as water being. So it's a kind of lots of very interesting, very local narratives of the kind of communicating with the water spirits. And it's kind of also embraces shamanic tradition, pre-Buddhist, it also embraces Buddhist tradition. It also now very much influenced with the modern environmental kind of awareness about the pollution and all these things. But what actually surprised me in local mining communities, like gold miners, jade miners, they worship water deities for different reasons, because water deities in kind of in the Buddhist tradition, they are also keep undersurface treasures. So in this case, it's kind of I think quite a big contradiction, because you kind of nowadays water deities are feminized, and they became kind of part of this environmental kind of ecological protest movement against capitalism, against kind of extractive economy. But at the same time, you have the same other bunch of people who do this extraction, who do pollution of the waters. They also worship these deities, but for different reasons. And at the same time, I'm just putting lots of things together, hoping that you will kind of answer. And at the same time, I'm interested in this kind of a cosmopolitical aspect, because what I lack in all this picture, how government and present nation states attempt to appropriate this ecological movement. So it's a kind of why I'm thinking about this term, because like at the end of November, I think that last year, the Nagas, symbol of Nagas, became national symbol of the Thailand. So it means that government, state also comes into the, not controlling, but appropriating this water forces. So it's just, I know that it's Thailand is a bit different tradition, but at the same time, it's directly linked to the Nagas in the Hinduism. And with all these kind of hydrological societies in Asia, I mean, water beings, whether they call Nagas or Losat or Los, they're kind of very, very kind of important. And in this case, I'm kind of still kind of thinking about this political turn of appropriating this very feminine, very kind of watery beings become political symbol of time.
Thank you. That's a feast of a question.
Oh yes, exactly.
But really important points. I mean, I'll take the three key things. One about water beings and treasure. There is a sort of internal logic to this, in that you have water beings who are traditionally generative of life and health, and that ties in with notions of wealth and productivity. So in actual fact, then it's not difficult to sort of reframe them as representing the source of underground wealth and health and treasure. And you find that popping up in quite a few mining communities where, you know, the notion of the underground as being generative has a completely new form in terms of the extractive industries, but it has an old logic, if you like, that they're withdrawing this wealth from under the ground. So it's not as incompatible as it may seem, although we tend to think of mining as being fundamentally destructive. Of course, it isn't to miners, it's fundamentally productive, and they are the generators of wealth for, you know, Australia's resource economy is entirely dependent on mining. So there is a little logic there that I think, but there's some very nice work being done on the underground and how and what it means that meshes with this in an interesting way. And those kinds of contemporary readings by extractive industries are an important part of it. And then you're talking about the appropriation of the ecological movement and the Nagas. I mean, Nagas are amazing. They start off, you know, in the sort of Indus Valley. You get going all across India, and then you get the Chinese Buddhists coming as pilgrims. We bring them into Asia. They adopt them. They become the dragons. And of course, China is one of the most interesting places in terms of water history, because you've got such a sort of diverse set of cultural, all drawn together in by the imperial dynasties. And then of course you can't really talk about water in China without mentioning Wittfogel and the notion, because I mean Wittfogel's work has clearly been controversial in terms of its sinology, but I think what's uncontroversial about it is the relationship that he draws between controlling water and having political power. And that brings us back a little bit to how the imperial dynasties managed to assert much more wide Chinese, and uniting all these different cultural groups into a Chinese identity. And they even managed to rewrite some of the ancestral being stuff to have a sort of pan-Chinese kind of notion of things. So the religious transitions are really interesting. But you also find that because dragons, serpents are such powerful things, they often get appropriated to demonstrate the power of, you know, the Romans with their Draco whistling flags that would shriek, that come. You get them on flags and in heraldry, where they get appropriated to go, yes, I'm absorbing this power of the water beings and dragons. So that national adoption of symbolic meaning like that is, I suppose, another takeover in a sense, one that's based on nationalism rather than religion. Does that sort of, I'm not, you know, your questions were quite fluid, so
yes,
I hope I've sort of answered them.
Yes, I'm kind of still thinking about it.
Yeah, no, but that's a great topic to be looking at.
But I mean, we start from the translating religious text, kind of primary religious, and then see how all these practices were related by Buddhism and kind of spread over the region, and what kind of rituals people do that, and what made them kind of look to revive these rituals.
Yeah. Well, you've got several different things happening there, I think. I mean, historically, you've got this very interesting take of dynastic emperors and powers, in which the dragon ceases to be so localized and becomes a symbol of that centralizing imperial power. But you've also got all these subcultures ticking away within that. And I've used a very nice example by a Chinese anthropologist of a place called 10 Mile Village, where they suppressed all worship of the ninth dragon god that was supposed to bring rain in that sort of pogrom against religiosity. And they carried on doing this secretly and hiding their dragons from the party officials. And now it's sort of resurfacing, and they're recreating their traditional rituals. So there's a lot going on there, I think. But
and sorry that I just give you, because if you do.
No, but please keep going. Then we'll ask you.
Yeah, so okay.
Finish your train of thought. It's absolutely
Yeah,
fascinating.
I'm
Please,
just
you're
afraid
most
that
welcome.
word that I'm just taking the full attention. Yeah, so I mean, I'm just surprised about the role of the kind of Buddhist monastic communities in the way how they propagate this water cult. And if you take this kind of Indian early Buddhism, so it's a bit different, you see, because it was kind of linked to the irrigation system, to, I don't know, agriculture style. But in the Asia, like Mongolia and Siberia, they don't have, like, all societies never depended on agriculture that much. It will almost be kind of, I don't know, cattle breeding, and yeah, not much of irrigation, but still, I mean, in this case, I was kind of trying to understand your idea that you link this kind of growing importance of the water deities with the development of agriculture. But in the Asian case, it's kind of probably different reasons for it, but still there are a lot of very powerful waters. And we never think about in Asia, we think about this kind of mostly like barren landscape, mostly kind of with nomadism and everything, but in reality there are a lot of very powerful rivers. And there's very interesting local kind of mythology about kinship system between rivers, kinship between people who live on these rivers, so it makes kind of very different kind of picture when you put water.
Yeah, I think you've got some very nice notions in that part of the world of how rivers connect communities and sort of define their kinship with each other, which is quite common.
Marry, rivers can divorce, siblings can run away from parents, parents try to control children, I mean really children who runs away from them. So it's an interesting kind of reflection, as you say, of the society kinship with this water-based kinship.
Well, it's the ultimate substance of connection. I don't know if you're familiar with the McManaman's notion of the hypersea.
Yes.
You know, but this is a lovely book, and it's I think they're geographers or hydrologists or something, but they tap into the notion that when evolution brought creatures out of the archaic oceans onto terrestrial land, they brought the ocean with them. So all organic life remains dependent on a constant flow of irrigating water, and this is what they call the hypersea. And what it underlines very beautifully is the notion that water flows between organic beings and connects them. And this ties into some really nice ideas in anthropology about how kinship is constituted substantially by blood, and blood, of course, is mostly water. So you get these kind of interesting homologues between the notion of individual familial connection through blood and water, and then, as you've expressed, the notion of rivers connecting communities, in particular social relationships, and like everything to do with water, it always operates on every scale. So the hypersea is like the sort of global scale of connection. Everything is connected by flows of water.
Yeah, and then Buddhist concepts of kind of water deities, so they're also kind of responsible for all viruses, microbes. Viruses and microbes is kind of all water which is in the body tissue, so that's why the kind of the COVID was interestingly interpreted from this water deity kind of Buddhist framework. So it was also very interesting to see all this sudden whole range of explanation of the COVID origin. Of course, it was environmental, of course, it was to do with the kind of lack of something today.
Well, that's fascinating. Let's bring another person who'd like to ask a question. Would you like to ask something? Or
I could.
Please.
I'm thinking about Africa, and where I work, it seems to be the snake. It's not really a water beaver. The snake is very significant. But I think the snake is significant, not necessarily because it's in the water, but because it mediates between what is below the ground and what is above the ground. The snake moves back and forth. So below the ground are the dead, the ancestors, so the ancestors are below the ground. Below the ground is mineral wealth, and then so it's the death, but also the generation from the ancestors. So those meanings. But water is seen as a portal from above the ground to below the ground. So that's.
I think that's a very common notion of a snake, that that they replicate that movement between the invisible and visible domains. But I mean, all across Africa, you've got rain shrines and water spirits. And for example, I was in Malawi a few years ago, and they have this wonderful serpent being called Napolo, who lives underground and creates landslides when he's unhappy. And one of the things I found most interesting about that is the way in which he's been translated to create a critique of modern agricultural practices, of promiscuity and AIDS, of political unrest of various kinds. And so you find that these sort of very typical sort of serpent beings that previously created landslides and floods when people misbehaved are now being translated on a more national level to critique social issues of that kind. But I don't think you go anywhere in Africa without finding pools and water spirits. There's also some very nice ethnography of rain-making rituals, rain sacrifices.
Even the rain is not necessary to the snake.
Yeah. And of course,
there's also a difference between flowing water and stagnant water. So the flowing water is seen as very good. The stagnant water, like dams and so on.
Yes, I think that touches on a really important point, that quite often part of the critique is the impropriety of damming and impeding the normal flows of water. So, for example, I examined a doctoral thesis not long ago which dealt with how water beings are being used in Lesotho to critique the appropriation of water sources by South Africa, and to sort of point to the problems created by sort of dams and impediments. And you get the same thing in Aboriginal Australia, that there's an impropriety to impeding flow in the environment.
There's a kind of water, snake-like thing called the big bird with the big wing. It's called Mamukebe. It lives in most dams. So if you disturb the nature, then it will go into the sky and it will cause storms and floods. And usually it's the whites who disturb the nature, and then this being takes revenge, and it can move from the water up to the sky. But then in mining as well, there's a snake. So the whites have to come, they go dig the mine, they have to pay homage to the snake, and then they can mine. If they don't, floods, rock falls.
They do tend to demand respect of water beings.
So there's interesting, how do you say, similarities and differences. And also the water is female. Water is usually female, but the snake is ambiguous. It's both male and female because it can fertilize itself, and it also because the mouth and the tail.
So there's a classic male-female androgyny inbuilt into it. No, that's good.
And that's why it's creative and powerful. And then also the shedding of the skin and the renewal.
Oh, thank you.
The snake is but the fish don't really feature in mythology.
Not so much, although you get some interesting stuff coming from Egypt into Africa that's concerned with fish. But certainly, you know, everywhere I've been in Africa, there's been wonderful water beings. But the Mami water stuff, of course, is the well-known figure. But that's actually something that it's sort of like an umbrella figure for an awful lot of other similar belief systems. That's mostly down the west coast. Yeah, but where I was in Malawi, you have Thunga, the python being, and the Earth Mother, and that's another gender complementarity there, and a lot of rain shrines, and yeah.
But in Europe, the sea is masculine.
You think so?
That's what my Italian students do. The women are not allowed to go on a boat on the sea.
Really? Okay. I'm not sure that's a prevailing notion. But I mean, when you often find, you know, that water can be either, really. I mean, you get male and female rainbow beings, you get male and female serpent beings, you get interesting gender complementarity in this part of the world between wells and sacred groves, for example. There's lots of permutations of how that complementarity works. But, you know, waves and femininity, you'd find a very different perspective. But you know, water really can be either or both, I think, for different people. Yeah.
But I'm surprised by the male representation.
Well, that's again absolutely fascinating. I think what we should do is start bringing in our online audiences. We're just about at 1:30 now. But just before we move to colleagues online, and don't forget, push your questions into the Q&A box and we can see them. There's several there already. Thank you very much. I'd just like to let the publisher say a word about the book. You know, and maybe tell the audience here whether there's some small discount for them or whether there's a paperback coming soon. Not that I wish to cut into your hardback sales. But anyway, would you like to say just a word or two?
Yeah.
Please, but speak up for the microphone.
Right. Yes, there is a discount on the day. There's a code, I think, shared for online. Water 22 is on the chat. And we have some books here as well for to purchase on the day. It's just come out in March, I believe, or April. So it's not been very long.
It looks very beautiful. You've done a wonderful production job, so congratulations. And I'm sure as we have the author with us, she will be happy to sign a copy or two.
I would indeed. If you didn't all catch that online, Alex is saying that there is a discount code available for the attendees on this occasion, and he's very kindly agreed when I asked him that we might also send you the flyer with that code on. So if you would like to have it, you can make yourself a little bit of a discount there.
Well, now I would like to turn to our colleagues online, but please also retain your thoughts here. And there's a nice clear question, or two questions from Ajay Patra. But I'd like to ask the second one first, because I think it goes to the heart of the matter. And Ajay asks, does this symbolic takeover of water beings by humanized forms also symbolize the dominance of literate traditions over the purely symbolic?
That's a really nice question. Thank you for that.
Yes.
Yes, I think that something happens that's really very interesting when literature makes it possible to create a historical record, because what you find quite often then is mythological figures becoming historical figures, and so it tends to assist that process of humanization, because it is written at a stage where that's kind of what's happening. So you get some beings who are serpentine in form previously, but by the time they get written down into religious texts, tend to be described as in human form. I'm trying to think of a good example. Yeah, there's some. What would be a best example? Well, there's a very nice work on the goddess Raja Gauri in India, which describes how it starts off in an abstract aniconic form as a lotus, the lotus being the analogue of the serpent rising from the sea. There's some very early lotuses in this history which emerge like serpents from the primal sea and open up, bringing the light. And that although they don't stay very present in Egyptology, they catch hold in Asian religions in a very real way, and you also see them as I mentioned in Mayan religions. So Raja Gauri undergoes these kind of transitions from being a lotus natural being into being semi-human, but still with a lotus head, and then being an entirely human figure. And by the time they get to those sorts of stages that they're written down, they tend to be at the same time, really. So I think the process of the literary emergence of religious texts is actually, yes, a very key part of that. So it's a really good point. Thank you.
And we also have the ability to get colleagues online live, and I can see two colleagues have put their hand up. So if you would like to ask a question live, you need to put your virtual hand up. Yeah. And I see yours, Judith, but the first person to put their hand up was Yana Rehak. So could you get her live, please?
Yeah. She just needs
to come onto the screen.
Unmute, and then she can speak.
I think I'm in.
Yes, go ahead. You just need to speak up a bit.
You have to shout, Yana.
Thank you, Veronica. Very inspiring. Know your work, follow it. I have two very specific questions. One, would you see that the depiction of fire out of these creatures' mouth is a symbol of soul or agency? And I wonder if you engage at all with this concept of agency agency dragons have, but also perhaps agency that then connects to nature, the concept of nature. And the second question is more applied. So I have, being anthropologist in environmental and ecological areas, I have last couple of years been interacting with environmentalists. And it's very easy for anthropologists to accept the local knowledge, including spirituality and imagination. But I have encountered that it's much more difficult for environmentalists, environmental scientists to accept this. And specifically when it comes to, for example, concept of restoration, concept of regulations and policy making, they really cannot easily accept the kind of imagination. And I was wondering what you have to say about that, because it's a real challenge for me as an anthropologist to, for us, so many of these imaginative parts or religious, cosmological are part of our work and we are used to it. How do we make this closer or available to these policymakers and environmentalists who are very sciencey and empirical and don't want to engage with cosmologies? Thank you.
Thank you, Jana. There's three lovely questions, really. Firstly, about the distinction of fire, which I think is a really interesting question, because one of the things that fire has symbolized over time is enlightenment, the notion of fire and light. And what you get is water beings bringing fire and bringing consciousness, which then gets translated into more humanized beings. So, for example, a very nice example is the sort of early Old Testament material, or even before that, actually, you get the Greek copper serpents, which are fiery, literally translated as fiery serpents. So they are consciousness bringing copper serpents that are celestial beings. And then that gets translated in early Testament writing to the seraphim. And there's a really interesting transition here between early and late biblical writing, because in early Testament material, you still have your replica storm gods like Baal and Elijah. You have the seraphim. You have the seraphim bringing a burning coal to bring consciousness and so forth, and carrying it on rainbow wings. So I think the notion of fire, heat, and enlightenment is actually an important thread through this. And we tend to get distracted by the notion of fire as being necessarily destructive, but of course it's also generative in its own way. And then it gets complicated in the medieval period because there are volcanic eruptions that bring pestilence from the air and tend to push the dragons into being seen in much more negative ways, as punishing fire, if you like. So yeah, that's definitely something worth thinking about, because the notion of fire and consciousness is very interlinked in lots of interesting ways historically. And then as to agency, well, in a sense, this whole research project is about agency. It's about where agency lies, because what you've actually got is a transition from societies in which the non-human world is seen as being co-creative and having a lot of agency and authority, to a contemporary Cartesian view in which humans are seen as having all the agency to act on the material world, and then with a critique coming from indigenous communities and so forth, and also from academics thinking about materiality and agency, a critique trying to restate the notion of the world as being composed of living kinds, all of whom are creating a shared life world. And then you try to carry it across into policy and practice. You have to do a lot of translation. But that, in a sense, is the most important thing to translate. You know, it may be that your environmentalists and regulatory folk are not going to get into understanding water beings and what they mean, but what they might be persuaded to do is to engage with the notion of how they represent non-human co-creativity. So if we wanted to shift away from the anthropocentric place in which we're largely stuck, then part of it is challenging that notion that humans are acting on a passive material world and recognizing the co-creative nature and therefore the rights that non-human beings need to have, and how we should be thinking about equalizing that relationship to being more reciprocal. Because if it's not reciprocal, if it's purely exploitative, we're in a lot of trouble, and we are in a lot of trouble. So yes, I mean, in a sense, for me, the kind of work that I do is very much about academic activism, trying to change how people think about these things. And if through enticing them with these beautiful water beings, I can get them to think a little bit more about non-human agency and issues of power and inequality, then in a sense that's what the work's for. It's to bring them into thinking less anthropocentrically and to recognizing the non-human as a partner in things. So that's what I hope this work helps to achieve. But it is difficult. I mean, the whole debate about personhood has been very divisive in that way, because you get, you know, the legal people saying, well, it's really good to have personhood for rivers and forests and mountains, as they do in New Zealand and Colombia and so forth, because it gives them legal rights, like corporations. But then you get all these people protesting because they say it brings religion into what should be political and management issues. And most people don't like to be forced into a religious position of any kind. So it is a little divisive in that way. My personal view is that it can be a bit of a red herring, that notion of personhood, for precisely that reason. But it definitely has some functionality in raising an issue of non-human rights. But you could do without it. You could just say, let's have a declaration from the UN of the rights of all living kinds. You don't actually have to define them as persons. Let's have an ethic in which we take care of all living kinds. And actually what in a sense, rights for nature replicates the dualism that's the problem. And if we can sort of actually address that dualism more than the issue of personhood and dissolve those boundaries, then in a sense you'd end up very logically with, you'd stop talking about biological and cultural heritage, you'd talk about biocultural heritage, because you'd recognize that everything is co-created. You'd stop talking about rights for nature and just start talking about rights for all living kind. So I actually think there's more to be done to try to challenge that notion of the separation between humans and others. And that's what I hope these water beings help to do. Does that make sense, Jana?
Yes, thank you very much. That's very helpful. Thank you, Veronica. It was a pleasure.
Well, thank you for your question. Judith, are you still there? Or should we find out if you're still there, more to the point? Can you do that, sir?
Yeah. You can unmute now, Judith, and speak.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can, go ahead. Just speak up a bit.
Thank you very much. I have a rather sore throat, so my voice is not very loud. I just want to say how apt it is that your presentation coincides with the current scandal about the disposal of sewage in rivers and in the sea. And is it more than that? There's no idea about spirits or anything to do with the water. Water can just be a transit for polluted items from the human body. And it's okay to put it into the sea and rivers. And then those who work for the water authorities have huge bonuses worth millions. And now, ironically, the new spokeswoman who's been presented as somebody to apologize, to me, it's no coincidence that she's a woman, that she's there to apologize. But it is very distressing that with secularization, we find this absolute disdain for the purity of water and the appreciation of water in rivers and the sea. I wondered if you'd thought about that.
Mentioning the sewage into rivers just sends my blood pressure up slightly, but I'm not as pessimistic as your view, because actually I think part of the revulsion that people feel about the pollution of the rivers is rooted in the idea that they are more than just flows of H2O.
Yes.
You know, there's a sort of deeper front. I mean, there are very few issues that create more emotive responses than pollution and foul flooding. For example, the idea of human sewage flowing through your house is abhorrent, and it's abhorrent partly because it's dead matter and partly because it's in, you know, obviously in the wrong place, as any kind of pollution is, as we know. So I actually think that some of the outrage that's been expressed nationally about sewage into the rivers gives me some optimism that people do still have a more than sort of Cartesian notion of water and what it means to people. And, you know, you scratch the surface, people tend to talk about water in purely management terms, as you've suggested. It's just a transit for pollution, it carries it to the sea. And yet you have really interesting notions like even the water companies have what they call the magic mile. Does anybody know what the magic mile is? It's the distance in a river by which pollutants are meant to disperse. So they think if they pump sewage in here by a mile downriver, it will all been dispersed and diluted, it won't matter. And of course, they're very cynical about this. But you've also got the notion of the sea. Now, somebody mentioned the sea earlier. The sea is the great sink to which, when you think of rivers as time and flows of life, the sea is the end of life space in which people dissolve into non-being. And it's a great sink, and it's supposed to regenerate. In a sense, you get a little sliver of that kind of thinking when it comes to pollution. If we send it into the sea's agency will dissolve it. The salt water will purify it. The sea will swallow and get rid of it. And it's not a very practical idea, but it's a very powerful idea that the sea has the agency to do that. So I think there are probably deeper layers of thinking in this debate over sewage than are immediately obvious, because public discourse doesn't have a lot of room for it in the kind of thinking that we're talking about. But it doesn't mean that people aren't actually having that, you know, sort of emotive response to sewage in the rivers. I mean, you know, I live in Oxford, as I know you do, and the outrage of there being water in the river is really very beyond a practical critique. So I'm a little bit optimistic. Not very. I mean, I think the idea they're just going to carry on making massive profits and dump all the costs on the public is outrageous, but let's not start me on that one.
Thank you.
Well, and thank you for your question, Judith. Well, we have one here online from Beatrice de Almeida. Would you like to ask your question live? If you would, then you'll need to highlight yourself virtually, and then you will pop up, and then Heidi can unmute you. So we'll just wait for a moment whilst you decide whether you'd like to do that. For some people, write their questions at work, you see, or from work. You have to be a little bit careful about saying, would you like to ask a question live? And they frantically start texting, saying, can't do that, can't do that. You'll have to just take it as it is. So we'll just wait for a moment and see whether Beatrice would like to ask a question live. Apparently not. Perhaps we have somebody who is at work. So Beatrice says, there we are. She says, she writes in, so it's not great for her to talk, fine. Beatrice says, thank you very much for your analysis. I am beginning research about gender and water in rural North Portugal. I am thinking about how to tap into these temporally distant folkloric stories or beings in the European context can be empowering for gender identity today and in the future. Any ideas of how we can channel and build this, especially within predominantly elderly communities with such ingrained Christian dualisms? Thank you. And is that question clear? Would you like to see it written down?
I'll do my best with it. Thank you, Beatrice. Northern Portugal, well, of course, that is an old Celtic area with an awful lot of Celtic history and beliefs in water beings and so forth, some of which is still very well recorded in that part of the world. But I think that your point about how dualism is ingrained is a really important one, because it is quite hard to shift away from that kind of binary thinking. You know, the notion of nature as other has had 2,000 years of entrenchment, really. How do you get people away from it? Well, that's why I think that you know, representing the creative capacities and the fact that, you know, the entanglement of human and non-human activities is key. I think anthropology has a really important contribution to make in challenging really quite false assumptions that humans somehow operate in a bubble that's separate from nature and can just externalize the costs to it. So I think that our job is to build a powerful narrative about the collaborative nature of human and non-human activities, and to recognize that breaking down. And I'm thinking here of the work of Donna Haraway, of course, and Anna Tsing, and Marilyn Strathern's recent work on relations. You know, the just challenging that dualism is probably one of the most important things that anthropology can do, and then present. And this is why I think our water beings are useful, because they articulate the notion of non-human agency. And quite often, you know, when you try to unpack everything anthropologically, it's very difficult to bring public audiences along into sort of anthropological theory and so forth. But if you can show them, and you can see this in some of the work that's emerging on art and literature, where your water beings are expressing a very different set of ideas. I mean, if you look at things like The Shape of Water, you actually have models of a non-divided relationship in that way, telepathic, ancestral dragons, etc. All of those things break down that sharp division. So I think, you know, we need to have a good intellectual debate that is accessible about the need to undualize what we have, but we also need imaginative vehicles like water beings to express it without necessarily being explicit in that way. But it is a challenge, because I think that binary division is what comes naturally cognitively to human beings. And I mean, look at the gender debate and the anxieties that it creates when you have categorical uncertainty. And I think humans do have a kind of need for categorical certainty. And this is clearly part of a process by which we divide culture and nature. But, you know, if you look at this historically, if you look at this across cultures, there are plenty of undivided worlds out there. We just have to bring them into this one as exemplars. And yes, your audience in northern Portugal may be a challenge in that way, but take them back in their own history to Celtic beliefs, and you will find a sentient landscape populated by non-human sentient beings. So maybe going with the local history is the way to go. That's what I would suggest.
Thank you very much. There we are. And there's a text from Beatrice saying, thank you very much for your answer, which she found very helpful. Thank you very much for interaction. And Sriracha, I know, prefers that we ask their question for them. So they write, thank you for your sparkling remarks. Are water beings essential to a better understanding of the origins of humankind? Are water deities and the global stories about them a blueprint towards a more ample understanding of the inner psychology of both gender and physiology? And origami fractals theory that spirals outwards to encompass both cultures and society? Thank you very much.
Well, I would give a resounding yes,
Yes,
of course, to that question. I think they really do give us some insight into that foundational layer of engagement with the non-human domain, and how people really interacted with it. And they are fabulously illustrative of these recurring themes across cultures. So yes, I think they've got a lot to tell us. I'm sure they've got a lot more to tell us than I've found, and I've been doing this project now for several decades over time. But they are fascinating, understudied, and I just hope actually that my little effort will encourage more attention on water deities and those very important religious, technological and political changes, because I think they do give us a lens, a way of seeing how that happens. And that comes back to my earlier point, that they are a narrative device. They focus the story of how we got from there to here in a way that's understandable, and they're very enticing. I mean, I chose them partly because everyone loves serpents and dragons. They're interested in them, and they're a way of drawing broad audiences into really complex issues about social and religious and environmental change. So I think they're very useful in that way. So yeah, thank you for that.
Well, I mean, I think you have a very clear answer there. Now, we have a question here from Maria Sakieva. Now, would you like to ask, again, would you like to ask a question live? If so, do put up your hand. And we can get you onto the system. No? Well, Maria writes, I love your special issue on water in Society and Natural Resources, 2016. And she says she would like to refer to the brilliant collection edited by Wagner and Yaka, Freshwater and Place in Oceania, 2018, which she recommends to the whole audience. And she says there are 3 dichotomies in the book, presumably Wagner and Yaka's book. One is about water or river subjectivity, which means thinking about the river as an entity with their own social life. She asks, what do you think about subjectivity from the analytical point of view? River subjectivity seems intriguing but problematic, perhaps because humans are hardly able to catch non-human subjectivity. Thank you very much.
That's a challenging question, water and subjectivity. I mean, I suppose that if I was going to follow that thread, I would look to some of the wonderful multi-species ethnographies that make that kind of imaginative leap into non-human worlds. So I'm thinking of Helmreich and Kirksey and of course Anna Tsing, people like that. Water and subjectivity. I mean, I'm not, you know, there's a lot of quite sentimental talk about rivers and their being and so forth, and I try to avoid that because I think it's actually something that deters decision makers from engaging with this kind of topic. So I sort of skirt around. I mean, I've just written a piece called Listening to the River, so I'm completely contradicting myself, but it's more about having a real appreciation of the needs and interests of a river and the needs and interests of all the non-human communities. And that is something, of course, from which we can draw from all kinds of disciplinary knowledges. I mean, some of you might have read some of my stuff on reimagined communities, in which I propose that to break down the dualism that we've been talking about, we should, instead of taking Benedict Anderson's wonderful book of Reimagined Communities, in which he thinks about how we all think about the different human communities, if we treated river catchments as reimagined communities and fold into that thinking the notion that there are a lot of non-human communities also living in a river catchment, then we could start to apply natural sciences and so forth to understanding their needs and interests and to representing them democratically. So we come back round to the notion of pan-species democracy and the representation of what non-humans, because it's not good enough to just say, well, we should have rights for nature if you don't actually do anything practical with it. So rather than talking about the subjectivity of a river, I'd be tempted to talk about the needs and interests of the river and its non-human inhabitants and how we get to represent those interests in decision-making process. And in a sense, that's where this book ends up. How do we bring that into practice? How do we reconstruct our engagements with rivers so that the needs and interests are not always overridden by human needs and interests? So how do we have a representational democratic process? And what I suggested is taken directly from Maori model of representing the needs of the river through which they regard as a living ancestor called Tuputua, and they have representatives whose job it is to speak to the river in public and political decision-making processes.
Like a river becomes a legal subject. Yes, the river becomes a legal subject. Well,
the rivers becomes represented in terms of, I mean, we have to interpret its needs and interests, obviously, but that's good science. We know what rivers need to work well. They need to be windy, they need proper habitats, they need a whole set of things, and not least of which a lack of sewage going into them. So the idea is that you would then have like a council of experts, or you could call it whatever you like, of people with the skills to actually articulate the needs of a good cross-section of beings in a river catchment, and then to be, and I'm just writing a piece for a legal conference. What kind of law would you need to have some kind of pan-species democratic representation? Well, you need something that acts as a filter in all decision-making process, because one of the problems we have is that environmental issues are siloed into a very weak and underfunded environment agency, while all the money and power goes to those involved with economic development, transport, housing. Well, actually, that compartmentalization is part of the problem. What you really need is to rethink our governance arrangements so that the needs and interests of not only human, but also non-human communities are represented in all of those processes. What are the implications of transport for a river catchment? What are the implications of more housing, more economic growth and development? And if those decisions had a voice speaking up for non-human needs and interests, well, they might be a little bit different. It'll be a start. Anyway, and that's the whole notion of pan-species democracy, is that we think about our structures of governance and how we represent other than human needs. And that's sort of what needs to happen at a practical level, I think. So yes, so subjectivity, it's an imaginative leap, and it's important that we make those imaginative leaps into other than human worlds. I think the whole multi-species ethnography thing has been very good for anthropology. It's taken us away from really a kind of blindness towards non-human interests. I mean, I remember back, and this is going back to about 2013, we had a debate at the AAS conference in Manchester. Should human interests prevail over environmental interests? And I was asked to speak for the environment. I actually thought we were going to get creamed in a bunch of anthropologists, because yeah, of course they're going to put humans first. But in fact, as we argued, I was with Helen Kopnina, we argued that we can't really meet human needs and interests without meeting the needs and interests of ecosystems and non-humans. So you can't put them first. But of course, that's what we do. We put them first. And that's what needs to change, because we're basically cutting our own throats by doing that. And we won, much to my astonishment.
Look, we're just out of time, but we've had an absolutely marvellous evening. So thank you so much. And I think we should show our appreciation in a more way. Thank you.
Thank you.